it was so great and so interesting. It had stimulated so much conversation since then among the folks who were there that I was like, let's just bring Elle up in person and then we'll get the real thing. So I'm really excited to share even more of your knowledge and experience.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. What can I say as a preliminary? So I really appreciate, I've never been here before, so this is very exciting for me. I don't think I've ever been this far north in Canada, which is shameful. But you know, that's how it is. Never been to Newfoundland either. So it is beautiful. Also, it's expensive to get there. So, but anyways, so I'm very happy to be here. I'm originally from Ontario. I've been living in, I arrived at SFU in 2004. So I have no excuse, is basically what I'm saying. I have no excuse. So I work on Coast Salish land, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And as a Canadian historian, you know, I've been thinking about and integrating Indigenous history and what I do and what I teach for a very long time. I'm also descended from Métis people. And my family, it's funny you asked about pronouncing my name right. So I'm an Anglophone. And when I go to Quebec and I say my name, people are like, what? And then they're like, oh, you know, I spell it out. And then they say back to me in a way I can't even pronounce. So that's how I pronounce it, which is not correct. But anyway, so my own family history is interesting to me, and I think connects with why I became a historian. Also, my parents were like, my parents not at all political people, but I remember, so I was born in 67. Maybe this is part of this story. I remember, you know, one point I asked my mom, like, why did you and dad have me? And she said, well, everybody was doing something for the centennial, so. Seriously. And then, I'm old enough to remember when Trudeau's, I guess, his second election, and my parents, that was the only time they put a sign on the yard was during that election. Big picture of Trudeau. So, and my mom became very like bi Canadian. So maybe, but I'm also on the political left and you're obligated to hate Trudeau. I'm talking about the first one. But I don't. I have this kind of affinity for him. And I did teach a class. So one time my students, I remember I teach Canadian social history, and my students, this was quite a long time ago, maybe 12, 15 years ago, said that they really felt they had no power to change the world or affect the world. So I thought, okay, so I created a course about a time when young students did feel empowered. So I for many years taught a whole course on the Trudeau era. So it's a period of time I really like to talk about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. As it turns out, I'm also going to talk about masculinity, ended up becoming a theme. It started with, so I guess one other preliminary mark I should say is, or two. So the context is what's going on in the world. So it's kind of building on the Zoom talk. I know some of you, but not all of you went to that. And so thinking about especially what happened in Alberta yesterday with anti-trans legislation. And so that's kind of the context for this talk. I don't talk about that at all, but that's what I'm speaking to, right? So this is a kind of, and my argument is we need to think about Canada becoming different. So we have this, so my original title was Troubling Progress Narratives about women's and queer rights in Canada. And I'm still talking about queerness as kind of the context, but I wanted to move back and think about like this narrative, because that's what history does. We write narratives about who we are as a people, right? And it's a highly political process, which I'm going to talk about. And so I went, as I do, because this is how I do my research. I just went into the Canadian archives and Googled Maple Leaf, because I thought this is, you know, how I start. It's not very efficient, but it works for me. I want an image, right, for my beginning slide. And so this image came up, and it was a Maple Leaf party, World War I in France. And actually what came up was these other photos came up first. I don't know how well you can see them at the back, but I thought it was a woman. I thought it was a man and woman walking down the street. And as I made my way through the archive, I could see that it was a man in drag. And this image doesn't really have anything in particular to do directly with the talk, but it ended up becoming a theme of like changing masculinity, right? And so this was a time in which men putting on women's clothes was completely normal. It was completely masculine. It didn't trouble masculinity whatsoever. So, right, that is not this time, right? So like everything else, historians, we think about change, and change is upon us. So I will pick up again on sort of masculinity and also gender as I make my way through. So the other thing I need to say is, I don't normally do these kinds of things where I speak to the present moment. I mean, everything I teach and I do is informed by the present moment, but I don't normally speak to the present moment. So this is my first time putting this together. So there's going to be a lot of gaping holes. There's a lot of parts that are undeveloped, and I don't actually have a conclusion. So there you go. So this is the beginning. Let's say this is the beginning of a conversation, and which makes it even more meaningful for me to get feedback from you about the nonsense I'm about to say. All right. So just here's some those photographs that I showed you at the beginning. So just a little bit of an overview of what I intend to cover. Just gonna keep it sort of thinking about history, identity, and belonging. And we used to talk about this a lot in the 90s and 80s. We don't really talk about it that much anymore, but kind of going back to those questions. So I'm going to start off talking about the role of history in shaping who we think we are as Canadians. And then sort of talk briefly about different forms of official identity, official national identities. And then coming to where we are in this historical moment, and then thinking strategically about sort of the role history plays in identity, but maybe moving us toward asking ourselves these kinds of questions, sort of what now? So it's really fascinating to me as a historian that one of the very first things Trump does is talk about history. Like, this guy doesn't even know history. We know that, right? Like, he says all kinds of nonsensical things. Yet, he makes a big deal out of this official statement from the executive office. And so I think it really speaks to, and so I'm sure you all know why, but so one of the things that this executive order said was to ensure that the Smithsonian, so that's, if you ever go to Washington, the Smithsonian museums they were, don't know if they still will be, they're amazing and they're free to go into. So this is what the federal government controls, right? So he wants to make sure that it celebrates American history and ingenuity, serves as a symbol to the world of American greatness and makes America proud. And of course, things like racism, slavery, this does not make us proud. Women's accomplishments, who cares, and so on. So, and we know he scrubbed transgender history from all kinds of public sites. I was just listening to a talk yesterday by Susan Stryker, who's the leading scholar on transgender history, talked about their own contributions being scrubbed. And I'm really fascinated with the fact that he didn't scrub the LGB, right? They erased the T from LGBT. And I find that really, really interesting, but not something we should take any comfort in either, I think. So eliminating improper ideology, we know what that's all about. Prohibiting funding from things that divide us by race. So talking about slavery is divisive. We shouldn't talk about it, for example, right? So, and we see this before. I mean, I remember 5 years ago talking about Putin and what he did in the Russian archives, right? So leaders do this all the time. They want to change the narrative about the past, right? And because in this way, we can see that history is an ideological tool of the state, right? And so historians, what we do is really, really important for that reason, or so we like to think. So I can remember a time, for example, when we had someone try to change the narrative about Canadian history, so who we are as a nation, and that person was Stephen Harper. So many of you will remember that he changed some of the symbology, right? So our passports, I think he might have also changed our money, some of the images on our money. He did change the Canadian citizenship test. Actually, a group of historians put a book out that was a critical analysis of what he did there. So actually, he was doing, in a way, exactly what Trump was doing, which is kind of rewriting the narrative to return it to this notion of greatness, grounded in the white men of the past, right? Johnny MacDonald and so on are founders and thinkers. But I think though, and ideologically, those things are really important. And that's the kind of thing I more concern myself with. So as a person, I'm concerned with the economy, but the economy isn't something I talk a lot about. But I do think, and reflecting on this, I think it's equally important to remember also that Harper sort of in many ways defunded science. So this was the beginning of climate change denialism, and science was a problem for industry, right? So there's many things he did. He reduced funding to the tri-agencies, Environment Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Libraries and Archives Canada, NSERC, the National Research Council, Institute for Health Research. He also who he appointed to these granting agencies was important. So Margaret Mullins, a climate change critic, and former executive director of the Fraser Institute, which is a right-wing think tank. Again, and important to note, the Fraser Institute, Simon Fraser, great founder, right? But also now we have a new right-wing think tank, which is the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So it's not insignificant that these are named after like these white founders, right? White male founders, very traditional view of history, right? And then, of course, muzzling the media. So federal scientists could not speak directly to the media about their research. They had to get approval from the government. So this was considered an assault, right, on knowledge, and decried by all media outlets at the time. Most offensive for historians was changes that he made to the census as well. Because we rely on this kind of data. I mean, I'm sure other people, they're scholars, but historians were like, this is really terrible, right? Because the census is so rich for us to write Canadian history. So I have a couple. Oh, I have a little Easter egg hidden in this thing. So if anybody catches it, that's a little competition for you there. I don't have a prize, but the prize is just the honor of catching it. Okay, so national identities are formed out of shared memories, myths, symbols, and traditions that link a community to its historic homeland, right? So what is our historic homeland? And so this is the role that historians have to play in this kind of discourse, in this dialogue, and shaping. As I say to my students, history isn't about the past, and they all jaw drop, what? And I said, no, like past is gone. They're all dead. Nobody cares. Well, maybe they care, ancestors, I don't know. But, it's for the present and the future, right? We want to like learn from the past to make a better future. At least that's the way I think about history. So that's the work, ideological work that we're doing. Stuart Hall said cultural identities come from somewhere. They have histories. But like everything which is historical, they undergo constant transformation. And I guess what motivated this talk for me is the talk I gave previously about the notwithstanding clause, which is what you see are happening in Quebec, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, is to sort of, it knocked me out of my own complacency about what Canada is, right? And my certainty about who we are. And I think this is a moment of both transformation, but also in history, we talk about continuity and change. So it's a moment of change, but the gift of history is that it shows us it's also continuity, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And my last quote, if the past feels morally unambiguous and virtuous, then restoring it feels righteous, right? So why is Trump doing this? Does Harper do this? Like, why do they even care about history? Like, I can tell you, enrollments are declining. Nobody cares about history. Yeah, the president of the United States, and prime ministers, they do care about history, right? Okay. So the three different nationalisms I'm going to talk about are the first one with the founding of Canada, 1867, was imperialism, Canadian imperialism. And there's this long period, there are many, many books on the subject. So there's this long period of the 50s and sort of ending with Trudeau, this shift away from that toward a Canadian identity, which I'm going to just talk about multiculturalism, because I think I'm going to make an argument that this is kind of what people like me rely on, is this kind of concept of what Canada is. And then I'm also going to talk about a little bit about Quebec nationalism, which is also another very important moment of defining who we are. So this is a postage stamp that came out in 1898. And the quote at the bottom, "We hold a vaster empire than has been." So initially, what did it mean to be Canadian? It meant to belong to something much bigger than ourselves, right? It meant to be British. Our identity was British, right? We flew the Union Jack. We sang "God Save the King or Queen," right? And this was part of this bigger global project, right? That connected us to South Africa, to India, but of course to England, right, as well. And so our loyalty as a nation was to Britain, and it was based on ideas of like duty and also gratitude, reverence for the monarchy. Some of you may recall, and it's, now it's part of, well, God, what's happening to the monarchy now? Never, that's a whole other thing. But, the celebration of coronations, for example, were really this was a really big event in Canada. Royal tours, royal tours were very good at kind of bringing people together to around these cultural events that celebrated who we were, right, and our connections. And it also helped define our relationship to the United States, right? Because the United States was this emerging revolutionary power, but we were this kind of part of this long tradition, right, of stability. And so that really was very much a part of this official kind of identity of who we are. But of course, that was based on settler colonialism, right? And all kinds of political philosophies around land being empty and for the taking, for example, a white supremacy, and we know those histories, right? I think now, thankfully, very well, we know those histories because they're really important part of the kind of logic of British imperialism and the logic of Canadian identity and the work that did. And so this led to not only ideas about Indigenous people as sort of uncivilized, right? But also race relations with Chinese people, with Japanese people, which I'll get to later, sort of the other Eastern Europeans, so this construction of the other has always really been part of nationalism, right? This idea of identities. The other is really important, right? I mean, we talk about, I was an English major, we talked about binary oppositions, right? And that binary opposition is really, really important in this kind of configuration of identity. And the point I'm going to make about multiculturalism is that it rejects that, which is why I think it's there's a richness there, but ultimately I'm going to argue that it's not enough. Anyways, okay, and so oh, I had an image, but anyways, and so there was a very particular, just to keep the theme of masculinity continuous, there's a very, of course, particular notion of masculinity. People will be surprised that in Canada in this period associated with our British identity was gun culture. There was a very strong celebration of gun culture, owning a gun, shooting guns, hunting, the outdoorsmanship. This is when the Boy Scouts movement was founded. This was being a Boy Scout was a very important part of belonging to the British Empire. It was militaristic, right? So this was training our youth to join militaries, shoot a gun, handle a gun, and this was also part of the nation building and national identities. Okay, so jumping ahead through a lot of history and historical change. I want to first talk, so Trudeau has this really, really interesting history. Trudeau is an elite educated by the Jesuits in Quebec, And I really believe that his whole approach to politics really shaped by what he experienced as sort of Catholic oppression around intellectual development. And the ways in which the kind of nationalism that he grew up really constrained and limited intellectual growth and freedom. And so he really rejected any kind of ethnic nationalism. To him, it was limiting, constraining, and an encroachment on freedom. So before I talk, I wanted to introduce multiculturalism. I want to talk about his idea of the just society. I can already tell now, I have way too much here for what I'm going to talk about. So at the time in the US, the President Lyndon B. Johnson talked about the Great Society. Trudeau talked about the Just Society, and he used this when he was running to become prime minister the first time. And his vision was, I find it actually, reading it now, really shocking. He says, no one in society should be entitled to superfluous or luxury goods until the essentials of life are made available to everyone. And he says, we're not there yet. Like, not even the NDP are saying this right now. He says the just society will be one in which all of our people have the means and the motivation to participate. The just society will be one in which personal and political freedom will be more securely ensured than it has ever been in the past. The just society will be one in which the rights of minorities will be safe from the whims of intolerant majorities. The just society will be one in which those regions and groups which have not fully shared in the country's affluence will be given a better opportunity. It's a political speech, so there's lots of repetition. The just society will be one where such urban problems as housing and pollution will be attacked through the application of new knowledge and new techniques. The just society will be one in which our Indian and Inuit population will be encouraged, this is important, encouraged to assume the full rights of citizenship through policies which will give them both greater responsibility for their own future and more meaningful equality of opportunity. I'm going to get into that. Okay. He says, he concluded this speech, on the never-ending road to perfect justice, we will, in other words, succeed in creating the most humane and compassionate society possible. I mean, to me, I don't know about you, but to me, those are very powerful words in this time. So multiculturalism comes about out of there's a Royal Commission on bilingualism and biculturalism. So it's framing Canada as this kind of, the two solitudes. And what happens during that Royal Commission is a group of Ukrainians come forward and say, WTF, like, hello, it's not just English and French. And so they end up doing like another third volume in this report, arguing about the role of the immigrant, right? And so out of this, to make a longer story short, grows an official multicultural policy that gets passed in 1971. So this is a rejection both of we're moving away now from British imperialism, but we're also moving away from just English and French, the founding peoples, right? The Europeans, to this idea that we are a collective of many different kinds of peoples. And we have this very Trudeauian, very liberal notion of equality within diversity. So I think that, this becomes official policy in 1971, and it was intended to, quote unquote, preserve the cultural freedom of all individuals and provide recognition of the cultural contributions of diverse ethnic groups in Canadian society. So it's really, what I find really interesting about it, and there's, I grew up on the criticisms of multiculturalism, and I agree with all of them. Nevertheless, as a model, I find it has a lot of potential, right? Because it moves away from this idea of a homeland, right? It moves it away from this idea of the ethnic body as being the owner, right, of the nation state. And instead says the nation state is actually a composition of diverse peoples, all of whom share in political equality in this state. Now, I just have to throw this in because I'm a historian of sexuality. This is also part of this vision of change that's happening is this omnibus bill that gets passed in 1969. So Trudeau was Minister of Justice, and the quote is said when the omnibus bill is introduced to Parliament, and it passes when he is Prime Minister in 69. And so there were three pieces of legislation there. The partial decriminalization of same-sex sex, as well as a liberalization of abortion laws in a very limited way, and divorce, right? So Canada, Trudeau is seen as this incredible progressive. He's also, I also like to joke with my students, he was also seen as very sexy, hot. Speaking of masculinity, masculinity is always something we talk about with leaders. We're talking about Trump now. And I don't, anyways, but I always say to my students, I know, think Austin Powers. But yeah, he was associated with Barbra Streisand. Some of you will remember. He was a playa, right? And Margaret Trudeau was quite beautiful. Yes.
This one, I think people need to know this.
Yes.
This is what you're saying. When I was a graduate student in Toronto doing my master's, it was very cool to buy these artisanally screen pressed underwear that had Trudeau Senior's face on the
Yes.
crotch.
Yeah. Those were made by I can't remember, but they're in Vancouver. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did. I bought my own child a pair of those. Yes. Yeah, because it came back. Anyways, that will be another slide in a future presentation. I can't remember the context of that. So Benedict Anderson, who famously published a book called Imagine Communities. He's not Canadian, but he was interviewed on CBC, and he said Canada is an imagined community divided not by its weakness, but by the plurality of imaginations through which it understands itself. So this is the vision, I think, that a lot of us sort of liberal, left, progressives really like and cleave to, and we think this defines Canada. And so the question I'm asking is this a moment of inflection? Is this a moment of change? Are we shifting away from that idea now? I don't know. It's a question. All right, so back to what are the problems with this vision of the just society? So Trudeau has this idea that there was a report that came out just previously called the Hawthorne Report, and it came up with this model for Indigenous people that's called Citizens Plus. So they're citizens who deserve full equality, but they have this plus status because of treaties and so on. They have this additional set of rights. The government has an additional set of obligations. And so building on the Hawthorne Report, to make a very complicated story brief and quick, Trudeau proposes what's called the white paper, not white because of white supremacy, but because policy papers are called white papers. And basically argue the proposition is that there is terrible inequality for Indigenous people. They are not full participating. So for me, it's helpful to understand the Trudeau's framework. Not that there's any excuses. I'm not excusing, but I think his framework is Quebec, the way he grew up, but also a commitment though to liberalism and the liberal state, and not imagining anything different than the liberal state. And within the liberal state, politically, we exist as individuals. And so you can endow each individual with equal rights, right? And that's how you get equality. But it's not a collectivist, right? It's not a collectivist philosophy or organization of society. So basically, the white paper argues, in short, let's get rid of Indigenous rights and make them full citizens. And this will create a better life for Indigenous people. Sounds good if you're not very informed. Sounds very good. And so the Indigenous people in BC, very particularly the IIA is very important, but other organizations respond with what they call the red paper. And what do they bring forward? And this is, I think, where it gets really useful is the idea of collective rights, treaty rights, right? So not we need to be valued as individuals, not this is racism, but there's a set of political collective rights that we need to defend, right? So it's not a race-based or ethnic-based argument. It's purely political argument based on political agreements and understandings. And I think that's really important because the way Canadians often understand Indigenous issues is around like racial difference, right? And I think it's important we talk about white supremacy and racial difference, but what's at stake here is it's not useful. Basically it's treaty rights, it's land, right? It's land, but it's also about a way of understanding how a society is politically organized. Harold Cardinal, who was very young at this time, I think around 24, 26, publishes this book, which in my Trudeau course I taught every year, The Unjust Society. So you can see he's playing with Trudeau's idea of the just society, right? And saying, actually, and this is if you teach history or are interested, I mean, there's a lot of great contemporary stuff to read, but that's an amazing book. And to think, you know, I love to always tell my students, like, it's not that we didn't know, we knew, like, so he documents the extraordinary abuses, the inequities, economic and health and so on in this book that gets published and was like big news. This was a big seller. This was not marginal. This was not a pamphlet handed out on a street corner. This was a mainstream book that was a top selling book. So very much a part of the discourse at the time. So the point I'm making here is that this is a really important flaw in the argument. This flaw gets reproduced in Quebec. So Quebec nationalism, again, I'm going to be really quick, way too quick, but because it's a rich and complicated and interesting story, but the framework for Quebec is we are an oppressed minority under the English, but also the Americans. So basically all the corporations in the United States, in Quebec are owned by Anglophones, but mostly America as well. And so the radicalism of the FLQ, if you've heard of them, that terrorist organization, if you read what they wrote, it's actually very Marxist, right? It's not, again, it's not about ethnic difference. It's a very deeply economic critique of oppression. So the famous book by Pierre Valliere is called, I'm going to use the N-word, it's in the title, and I think it's important, White Niggers of America. And again, I used to sign this book and my students said, reading it on the bus was probably really very, very careful, having that word on the front of their book. But he was using this, so you have to remember it's the 60s, it's this time of radicalism, right? In Black political movements globally, really, right? It's the anti-colonialism movement. And so he's arguing that in terms of the history of colonization, French people, the Quebecers, really occupied this role that Black people in colonized countries occupy. I think it's actually a smart argument. I think it's a good argument. In many ways, it makes a lot of sense. So you have this rise of Quebec nationalism, the overthrowing of the control of the Catholic Church, and you know, first with the Liberals, René Lévesque, who becomes the leader of the Parti Québécois. He was initially a Liberal. He was a colleague of Trudeau. So I love the contrast between where René Lévesque went with his politics and Trudeau. They make a great contrast, fun to teach. And so a lot of it was about economic power. How do we become a people who control our own fate, who control our own future? We have to control the economy and collectivize it, right? So Hydro-Quebec hydroelectric power was owned by all these corporations. There was like 40 different companies. And so they nationalized hydro, right? So here's the symbol from the 1944, when they first began nationalizing it. They started in Montreal and then moved outward. So Hydro-Quebec is this, interestingly, a very powerful symbol of self-governance, liberation, freedom, self-determination, Quebec identity. It's weird, but it makes sense. However, like everything else, you know, one of the important moments we can look to is the James Bay project, which floods Cree lands, right? So with total disregard to Indigenous people. And just speaking of my own history, I tried to find this image, but I couldn't. But I remember I was very pro-Quebec autonomy as a young person. And then I was watching the news one night and a group of Cree people held up a map and showed, this is how much of the land white people occupy and this is how much Cree people occupy. And I was just like, whoop, that flipped the narrative for me, right? Because I was like, okay, that made sense. So that was my introduction to the issue. So here is this kind of flaw. Yes, Quebecers are an oppressed people in that context, but of course reproducing the original oppressions, you could say, of the colonial state. So I think this speaks to what I'm trying to say here. And in saying this, I'm trying to bring together thinking from a sort of queer feminist perspective, right? To link up what we might think in terms of like, okay, let's cleave to the sort of human rights order that is the just society and multiculturalism, but instead think bigger, right? The invitation to think bigger. And what Leanne Bettis-Mosake-Simpson is saying here, Canada is not a finished nation, but a set of ongoing practices that continue to eliminate Indigenous political orders. So it's interesting she doesn't say people, right? And I think that's what I want us to pay attention to, is the political order, right? So this is what's behind this, right? Especially through targeting Indigenous women and queer people. So the 1970s, we get this explosion of women's history, labor history, history of immigrants, history of people of color, and so on. And this becomes part of our national narrative through heritage minutes. And I was in grad school, and what did we do for fun over beers? We critiqued the hell out of heritage minutes. And now, as I sit and write this paper, I'm like feeling so nostalgic for heritage minutes. Yeah.
A lot of people in this room don't know our
Yeah.
up for what they
And yet you do.
I do.
Yeah. They're actually, when I went on the website, they actually are still making them, which I didn't know. So Heritage Minutes, as you can see, started in 1990. And there were these brief commercials that aired on television back in the day when people watched television, that were capturing moments of Canadian history. And so this is a really good example of, so you probably can't see, but so we've got women, we've got Indigenous people, we've got important thinkers, we've got Maurice Rocket Richard, hockey, of course, Laura Secord, Gray Owl, Nellie McClung. The one that was the most offensive to us history grad students was the Underground Railroad, because it constructed this narrative that Canada, that enslaved people from the United States escaped to Canada, this place of great freedom and liberty, which of course is not true. Very simplistic. So a combination of some of the like conventional things like responsible government, right? That's like part of our narrative too, right? To like changing the narrative to normalize and celebrate immigrant people, women, workers, and so on. That was the Heritage Minute. So you can see the state is this very liberal state that's like integrating these narratives that Canadian historians are writing about marginalized people. Well, then comes Jack Granatstein, who actually taught me my Canadian History 101 at York University when I was an undergrad. He publishes Who Killed Canadian History? And so he's arguing that, scroll down, see if I can find the date. He's arguing, 1998. So he argues in this book that the job of Canadian historians is to write a national narrative that holds us together. We are a complicated big country with lots of regional differences. We need a strong narrative to hold us all together. And you people, focusing on women, workers, domestic laborers, the Chinese, whatever, right? You are undermining the nation state. It's your fault. So this is sort of post-Quebec referendum, right? Where we almost lost Quebec, the country almost fell apart. This is your fault, right? This new generation of historians, you're not telling us a strong, powerful narrative. So interestingly, one of my, I was in grad school. No, yes, I still was in grad school. And one of my comps teachers, Ian Mackay, wrote a book, an article, which I thought was great, called The Liberal Reconnaissance. So it was kind of a response to this, where he argued that one way to tell the history of Canada is that it's a process of liberal order, the liberal rule, right? The laws of liberal moving across the country. So it was very good. It was very interesting, but it doesn't create the celebratory narrative that we want, right? Because nation states need what are we celebrating, right? We want to feel good about who we are. And so the truth of the matter is, right, talking about histories of racial oppression, violence, genocides against Indigenous people, oppression of women and stuff, these are not narratives that make us feel good about who we are, right? So how do we craft a narrative that does that kind of work? So I'm probably not going to have time to get into this nearly as much as I'd like. I found this cartoon. It doesn't fit in seamlessly to my lecture, but basically, this is 1970 in the Edmonton Journal. It's two men looking at restrooms, and the door sign says men's and ladies. And the comment is that women's liberation movement has gone too far this time. So I love this, right? Bathrooms have always been this place of conflict. And a few years ago, I was looking at this book that came out in the 90s. This group of Vancouver lesbians, they were used to get these workshops on sort of anti-homophobia workshops for the women in the feminist community. And I came to this part about the myths around lesbians, and one of them was lesbians are washroom invaders. And when I read that, I thought, oh my God, I remember that. So as lesbians were becoming more visible, there was this panic about lesbians in the washrooms were going to sexually assault women. That really was a narrative that was there. So that this kind of idea of the washroom has been around for a little while, right? Causing panic around changing gender norms, right? I mean, that's the anxiety, right? Is changing gender norms. So the history here is more what we call a moral panic. And I'm just going to skip that, but it's basically a sociological theory that grew out of Britain and really has become useful for historians of sexuality, because of course, a lot of moral panics, the one that the person who, Stanley Cohen, who coined the term, was writing about was youth, mods and rockers and getting into street fights. But really, we talk about it probably most famously with McCarthyism. So again, this is the United States, the Cold War, the anxiety about communism, and how homosexuality, homosexuals became perceived to be a threat to the state because they were, quote unquote, morally weak and could be, what's the word? The Russians would get them to reveal state secrets. What's the word?
Compromise.
Compromise. Yeah, you get the idea, right? So, so there was this very direct assault on homosexuals, and it's maybe important to notice when we think about what's happening today, is that it starts with firing homosexuals and then becomes actual policy prohibiting hiring homosexuals 3 years later. So what starts as one thing actually becomes policy. Trump is on the fast track. But the other thing that's interesting to note, and I'm bringing all this up because, of course, what we're seeing today is this literally being played out in the exact same way with trans people, particularly trans women, is one way in which this narrative became popularized was by the children, right? The children are vulnerable and they're at risk of being sexually attacked by these perverts. This actually, this period and a lot of the logic of this period, not specifically this, but generally, this is what I did my PhD thesis on, was the thinking at the time. So let's come back to Canada. How did all this play out in Canada? So this is a picture of what was called the fruit machine. Some of you might have heard of it. It was a nickname. As you may know, homosexual men at the time were often called fruits. And it was a psychometric test to try and identify who is homosexuals. Because if you want to fire homosexuals, well, how are you going to figure out who's the homosexual, right? So they hired a guy, F.R. Wake, to can you come up with something? He comes up with this. We can talk about it later if you want. It's very, very interesting. There's a great TVO documentary about it. But I think one of the things I want to say here is, what about the influence of America, right, on this, our national narrative? Right? This is the question I think we need to be asking ourselves. So what is it about this? What's happening right now? What are the causes of what's going on? And how do we think about this? And so there were actual, like, real policy pressures on Canada to adopt what was called the Lavender Scare, the nickname that what happened in the United States, the attack on homosexuals, was given in Canada. So Canada adopted some of these policies in the United States as a result of pressure from the United States to do so, including adding psychopathic personality, which was a code word for homosexuality, to our immigration laws. And you could be prevented from entering Canada if you had ever been charged with a crime related to prostitution or homosexuality. You could be prevented from entering the country. For example, many, but the same policies were adopted for the military. Many people were fired. Same thing plays out in Canada. And partly it has to do with pressure from Americans to adopt these similar policies. So there's no doubt that the Americans, what's happening in the United States has influence for a long time, has influenced what's happening here. But it's only one of several factors, right? So another factor that we often talk about when we see, the process of othering, and so obviously what I'm referring to here is, in this case, targeting trans people, but also refugees, immigrants, and in Quebec, Muslim women, and so on, right? So kind of the other, right? And inventing these enemies. This person is a danger, they're a threat to who we are, our economy, and so on. So oftentimes we say, well, when there's times of economic stress, they look for someone to blame it on. And that's true. That also is a factor in fomenting hate in Canada, but not always. So this is Howard Charles Green. He was one of several MLAs in British Columbia who advocated for the internment of the Japanese. 1942. That was not a time of economic stress, right? It was a time of tremendous pride in being Canadian, the country coming together, real, a congealing around a tight identity. And also there was a lot of money, right? You got to pay for the war machine, so there's lots of jobs and so on. So the Japanese internment and the hate that was directed toward the Japanese, so casting them as this kind of dangerous enemy, is not always correlated to times of economic stress. And also that's another case where this image of the Japanese as this threat didn't come out of nowhere, right? This was a long-standing racial characterizations in Canada that existed. So I don't know if you follow Heather Cox Richardson. She's a historian in the United States, and every day, I don't know how she does it. Every day she writes these very long essays on what's happening. She came to UBC, gave a talk recently about this. I think she's writing it as a book. So she says the problem is the myth of the individual cowboy in America, that this really fuels a lot of American political ideologies. And the whole talk was about how that's not true. First of all, not white. And second of all, not autonomous. So it's very interesting. And so, maybe because of the first slide, thinking about men in World War II, this is the image of, this is my moment of levity in my lecture. This is the image of Canadian masculinity that I grew up with, right? Now, I don't have time to play this, but this is a really, really wonderful video. His name is John Lajoie. I recommend you watch this video. It's an old video, it's a hip hop video, and it's a total abdication of any responsibility. He talks about having backaches and being constipated, in a hip hop kind of attitude. It's really, really great. It's really, really funny. But, I don't want to defer. I mean, in deferring to those two images, right? Once again, we're talking about whiteness, right? The way in which, automatically, when we think about Canadian, well, what is Canadian masculinity? Of course, I know, I'm sorry, I apologize, but I do play with ChatGPT sometimes just to see what it does. So, of course, I put in, make an image of Canadian identity. And so it gave me a beaver and an RCMP and a lake, and stuff, right? And so I'm like, yeah, but wait, I mean, the RCMP, we always talk about that, but I don't know, like I've never felt like the RCMP is like a big part of our icon, who we really think we are as Canadians, like in terms of defining a Canadian masculinity. I don't really see it. But anyways, so this reminds me of a conversation I actually had at a party last weekend where I drank way too much, but that's irrelevant. So this photograph here is a guy, C.S. Wing, who was born in Quesnel in 1890, became a photographer, and really, really interesting guy. And when I don't know how well you can see this in the back, but when I saw this image, immediately I thought, well, this guy's gay, like queer as F. So I've been very excited about it, kind of obsessed with it. And, off the side of my desk, in this photo, so this is his self-portrait, and this is a photo of two men in it. So it's very interesting, the placement of the photo, the flowers, his relationship to the flowers, and his hair, again, I don't know how well you can see it there, but his hair is kind of high. And so I was at this party and I was showing it to this woman who teaches at Emily Carr, and I'm like, okay, you're in art, you will have something to say about this. And what I didn't know, but which ended up being a really great thing, is her father is Chinese. And she said to me, she just looked at me very frankly, and she said, I would be very careful about readings of masculinity on Asian men. And I was like, I understood immediately what she was getting at. And then she further said, I wouldn't necessarily read him as queer. He could be a dandy. And a dandy was a certain kind of masculinity that was available to heterosexual men. That kind of meant you were a player, a bit of a player. But anyways, her comment about Chinese men and masculinity and how that's situated within the Canadian politic is a really, really important historic one. And I was so grateful for her saying that to me. So it's really just kind of it's kind of been a little bit of a prompt for me in thinking through this kind of question about Canadianness and Canadian identity, and who we are. So I'm going to show you this. This is a 1-minute clip of Sandy Stone speaking in a documentary called Gender Knots that came out in the early 1990s.
Advantages or advantages or both of transgender is that the word trans implies a broad spectrum of identities through which we move and through which we pass, thousands of them perhaps. And as people conditioned in our society to only see two, the act of learning to see many is the supreme act, because it is the beginning of the path to discovery of self, of ourself, of myself, yourself, of deeply and importantly who we are. And only when we have begun the first steps on that journey can we really start to talk about trans.
So I'm just going to read again what she says. She says, one of the advantages or challenges or both of transgender is that the word trans implies a broad spectrum of identities through which we move, through which we pass, thousands of them perhaps. And as people conditioned in our society to only see two, the act of learning to see many is the supreme act, because it is the beginning of the path to discovery of self, of ourself, of myself, yourself, of deeply and importantly who we are. And only when we have begun the first steps in that journey can we really start to talk about trans. And why this is a transition to my conclusion here is because what I think is a very important reminder is that the women's liberationist and gay liberationist critique was not about equality within the existing system, but it was actually a critique of the entire system. And the idea of the liberation movement was not to gain equality for lesbian and gay people or women, actually to liberate everybody. So if you read what early liberationists were writing, they were talking about masculinity and the ways in which men were oppressed by the gender system as well as women. So feminism would liberate cisgender heterosexual men too. But getting there, though, required the kind of political change that Leanne is sort of talking about, right? A different political ideology, a different kind of political order, right? One based on collectivist principles, for example, right? And at the core of that critique, of course, is a critique of capitalism, right? And the ways in which it forces us or pigeonholes us, I don't know, to function not only just as individuals, but as competing individuals, right, in a particular kind of system. What does it mean to create systems, structures that support a different kind of life, right? So for Indigenous people, that life is ever present, right? For white folks, it was reinventing a past, right? That like maybe pagan, ways of being, or, going back to like communal ideas, right? That preceded capitalism. So it was about recapturing maybe old ways of being, whereas for Indigenous people, it's been about preserving and protecting and advancing existing ways of being that are under attack. So back to her. So fundamentally, the critique of what I do, of what Indigenous people are doing, and I'm sure other people as well, is to think about the political order, actually. So it's not to stop with this idea of equality, which is lovely and important. I value it. Means I like having it. Thank you very much. But it's just the beginning of something much, much, much more bigger, right? So where does that, so this is my conclusion, as I promised, my very compelling conclusion. But I think what I'm trying to think through, what I'm reflecting on now is the way in which I think this idea of human rights, right, that got written in, so going back to like Trudeau, patriation of the Constitution, 1982, right? That's all the process of getting rid of the last vestiges. Well, we're not entirely rid of it, as you know, but of British control, right? The colonial power, colonial structure. So it's very important getting rid of that. And embedded in the Constitution is our human rights. And as you know, people have used that, like queer people were not, sexual orientation was not originally included, it was fought for, blah, blah, blah. That has been the tool that we have used and we continue to use. And that is what is being challenged right now. So as a lawyer who's working on the Saskatchewan case pointed out to me, if Saskatchewan wins, and actually I was texting her this morning for updates, and now she's saying, look at Quebec, right? And what's happening, that's the thing to be looking at now, because I guess because that's the ruling that's going to come down first. Maybe she didn't give you a follow-up on the hijab, right? And the ruling around that in Quebec. She says, if the Supreme Court allows provinces to use a notwithstanding clause, then the human rights code is meaningless. It's completely meaningless. And I think, so I guess my theory is that that really defines us. It goes back to Trudeau's vision of the just society. It goes back to the multicultural policy, this idea that who are we as a nation? We are a collectivity of all kinds of different people. And we know it's imperfect, deeply flawed, even maybe a lie. And that's fair if people wanted to say that. That is totally fair. But at least it's a principle, right? It's a principle. And we know there's this existing one, MacDonald-Laurier Institute, Fraser Institute, right? So this there is a right, and we have our own right that says, let's go back to these white male founders of the nation and celebrate our national greatness. So that narrative is a competing narrative that also exists too. So I guess my question is, well, on the one, what I started with is, I think we're kind of at, this narrative is under stress and we might lose it, right? So I guess if I think about going forward, I think we need to revive or defend that particular narrative. And maybe I'll end with this. So this is how far my thinking has gotten with what I said in the car on the way here. How do you, like, let's say you imagine launching a campaign or having conversations with people, going back to this principle of every human deserves human rights. This, however you want to phrase it, right? Whatever slogan you want to use to defend this notion of fundamental human rights. And I was thinking about how in California, when they were trying to pass the same-sex marriage law, the first time they did it with Proposition 8, the arguments that activists were making were on the principle of human rights, basic equality under the law, and they lost. So they went to the marketers and said, what should we do? And the marketers came up with love is love. Now that is hugely problematic because I'm going to use a swear word right now. We're all over 18. Gay liberation was also very clearly about fucking, right? Like just challenging the morality that a good fuck could just be a good thing, right? And so love is love sort of subsumes, again, the more radical critique of sexuality to like romanticize homonormativity, blah, blah, blah. I get all that. But nevertheless, maybe there's a lesson to be learned there in terms of thinking about how do we engage, how do we shift the conversation away from, let's say, for example, parental rights, which is where the conversation is around trans care for kids, to having a new conversation about this kind of principle, right? And how might we be able to articulate it? And that, my friends, is as far as I've come thinking on this. Thank you very much for your attention.
And then there's like a nice 15-minute break where I'm assuming you will hang around and people can come up and ask questions or chat otherwise. But I do want to release folks who need to leave. So we have time for 2 questions and we should have a mic, but we do not. Santa Claus, please, more wireless mics for you in BC. I've been saying that over and over during Iowa. They should be in every room and they should work and there should be batteries. So who has a question?
And just one moment before we do that, I just wanted to let everyone know as well that at 11 o'clock, we have like a light lunch. I guess I would say that this is part of the Queers and Allies discussion series. But anyone is welcome to join us for that and to continue the conversation as well. So I'll go back.
Yeah, except MRAS 801, 802, sorry, you can come with friends and I back to our class to learn from each other. Laura.
Wow, phenomenal. This intersects with so much of my work.
Mm.
I'm
What's
currently,
your work?
so I'm going to talk about one research project right now.
Okay.
I'm looking at strategies for anti-Indigenous rhetoric.
Okay.
And trying to kind of that mushy middle, so to speak, how to get people onto our side.
Mhm.
You know, we talk about this just and unjust society,
Mhm.
and how do we actually convince or get people, you know, into these movements and into understanding, you know, this broader concept of we're not threatening your identity, we're
Mhm.
trying to, you know, maintain ours.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, we can talk about that later. I mean, yeah, I think it's a hard argument. I mean, what I'm trying to do, what I kind of want to do is understand the thinking on the other side. So this was really helpful for me to understand when I was doing this research, and I didn't come out of my talk, but the links between like anti-science, anti-vax, climate change denialism, and transgender care. And it helped me understand that. So my thinking now, my feeling is listening to that is because I really like, I think because one of the first courses I took as an undergrad was like main currents in Western thought. And so I really like thinking, like how do you structure your thinking, especially because I often think differently than other people. So I'm like, so I think I feel that understanding the paradigm, the worldview is going to be really important for figuring out good modes of communication, good ways of framing, because we can't, we can't just, it's not about principles. We can't say, well, on principle, like, whoa, that's not going to get you anywhere. So anyways, that's where I'm at right now. And I'm not a communication expert. Like one of the things I'm realizing is I'm very used to standing up in front of the class and just telling everybody what is. And I have no experience talking to people who don't believe what I'm saying, and I teach at SFU, students don't challenge me. It's like, they may challenge me afterwards, but they don't challenge me. I wish they would, because it'd give me more practice. But anyways, yeah. So you, as a professor, some of us become very used to just be, sharing our point of view, but not actually engaging in dialogue. So that's an area I'm trying to grow and expand my.
So just to reinforce that point, I'm gonna have to cut this dialogue.
Yeah.
Ask if there's another.
Or just comment too. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. You realize that you have been talking about right at right. Because whereas you introduced yourself as a Canadian historian, you talked about science, you talked about history and politics, and so it is a composition of right that we are discussing here.
Mhm,
And cutting it to your conclusion
mm,
on human rights,
mhm, mhm.
what about removing the word human and discuss rights?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Going forward, you realize that it's not only humans that are going to need rights, but even my class where I come from, where now we are heading more than human perspectives. So my thinking is, do you think we have that opportunity where, other than having rights to anything, we discuss rights and then put them where they are supposed to be? When we have transgender people looking for their rights, we go for that. When we have cows demanding for their rights, we go for that.
Mhm, mhm.
When we have professors or students, I think that, to me, that would be something that would be interesting and everyone.
Yeah. So Cher might know more, and others in the room might know, but so two things come to mind. Like, first of all, the idea that corporations are people in America, right? So if a corporation can act as a person and therefore have like rights, and also the other thought that came to my mind is, that's going to be the opposition, right? Like that, this is where capitalism really matters, right? Is all of these arguments are subject to capitalist forces, right? As we've seen with Mark Carney's budget, and I really wanted to go there, but couldn't. But anyways, so yeah, aren't there cases where like rivers? Yeah. So so this has happened, right? Where non-human entities have rights. So that is an avenue people have pursued with, I don't know how much success, but yeah, I mean, I think, and certainly that's those are conversations that are happening here, especially again, well, Mark Carney's budget and pipelines, right? Like, because, the relationship between the land, the salmon, the water, and human life, like we are interconnected, so yeah, thank you. Great question.
Okay, that could certainly lead to days of conversation, which I would happily sign up for. But before we do one final thank you, I would like to take a picture of this nice full room. So if you would not like to be in the picture, no judgment, put a book in front of your face, turn that way, run out the door. But otherwise, I think it's really important to capture audiences, not just for funders, but to mark their moments.
Funders are important
And
though.
yes, very important. If you are a feminist sitting on a pile of money, please get in touch with me. Because it is hard to fund and getting harder and harder to do so. I will use my co-organizer's privilege and tell you that also reading queerness across cultures is very difficult. As a Greek person and as a Montrealer, I will tell you, if you take your Northern BC reading of queerness into either of those places, you will be very confused. And you will think everybody in Greece is queer, which could very well be the case, but also might not be. So I really appreciated that example. And it also happens within whiteness, right? Like, yeah. And then I will also say a big thank you to you for another fantastic lecture that is a great example of how you're not supposed to give us all the answers. You're supposed to get us thinking and raising questions about where we are and who we are. And I think you've done both of those things. And thank you to this large audience. I hope a number of you will stay behind for lunch with Elle. And I'm sorry to take some of you away for lack of lunch with Dr. Murray and I. But let's give Elle Sheni a big round of applause. Okay, we have a 10-minute break before the next part of our class starts. So find your way back.
Oh, that was so good. Yeah. I felt like that was home.
Oh.
So good. Oh, I just wanted to point to like, oh, good.
Yeah, and just leave them in the.